So the point of like Empower Hour in general and like the idea of alumni coming back, I guess, virtually coming back to tell a story is really to reflect on our time at UCLA, which is just interesting mostly because um, COVID is like a really interesting time to reflect. And I feel like a lot of people are going through a lot of dramatic changes in their life, or maybe it's just me, but the universe, I think, is asking a lot of people to sit with themselves and think about, what we are doing to contribute to the way that our society looks, the way our communities look, and how can we contribute to change long term in a sustainable manner. And I think we've never ever had this time or this much time to think about our actions and reflect. And I really do hope it does catalyze like unprecedented, evolution at like individual interpersonal levels, but also at like systemic levels, hopefully.
So with that being said, I'm just gonna quickly introduce
Oh
our main
yeah, I
speaker,
totally
Ayesha.
forgot. Go ahead.
No worries. Um, so hi everybody, my name is David Sun. I, along with Corey Rosas and Sandy Nguyen, we work at UCLA Alumni. We're part of the Diversity Programs and Initiatives team. And we put together our signature events with EmPower being one. And today we're really, really excited to be working with Ayesha Khan, who will be our main speaker tonight. Um, so in addition to all of the amazing activism work that she does, I have a really quick bio that I'll read. She's also one of the leaders for our UCLA Muslim Alumni Association. And as you'll come to find out tonight, she was actually really quite involved and still quite involved during her undergraduate years in supporting a lot of organizations that really focused on building community. So I'll start with her bio. Ayesha Khan is from graduating class of 2015, a Ph.D. She is a grassroots activist, writer, educator, infectious disease scientist, and clinical microbiologist at the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston. She is dedicated to bridging science and social justice. Khan's activism focuses on Palestinian liberation, educational equity for marginalized American youth, racial health equity, civil rights of Muslims and other minorities in India, immigrant rights, combating the school to prison pipeline and mass incarceration in America, and intersectional science advocacy. She'll begin her medical fellowship training in clinical microbiology at Mayo Clinic in 2021 and is currently working as an essential healthcare worker, specializing in COVID-19 testing, pandemic preparedness, and public policy. And so without further ado, take it away, Ayesha.
Thank you, David, for the kind introduction. And thank you. I know a couple people hopped on at the end. So if you feel comfortable turning on your camera, please do. And if you feel comfortable, also feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, just your name and where you're at. And if you did go to UCLA or are at UCLA, or honestly, if you didn't go to UCLA also, what was an important space to you in college that you think contributed to your growth? So this could be community centric or your major, anything really. Hi, Sam. So I think the purpose, as I was trying to talk about before, is for alumni, especially when we reflect on our time, I think we have a unique opportunity to, one, go through the experience of being student activists and then growing out of that space and entering our communities and looking at what we call, quote unquote, the real world, right, out of the college bubble, and enter a realm of systems that we have never been in before, right? Because we progressively largely interact with educational systems as we grow, literally like that, like we're kids. And leaving college is like our first interaction with so many other systems. And I think all of it kind of happens at the same time. And everyone has a moment, I think, where they start realizing, wait a minute, um, there's a lot more problems than I thought they were, and they go way beyond the extent that I thought they went. And I think that's really natural. So I want like people to come in with that context, that you don't have to just know everything. You don't have to come in knowing everything. And it's okay to look back on even things that you've done that you think weren't as effective, and you could have definitely, improved on whatever you did before. So I think being kind to yourself is important, because it's a growing process, I think, growing pains. I'll do a thing where I share my screen when I need to, and then I'll flip back to my face. And again, at any point, if you want to say something, even if it's not a question, if you feel like, I'm speaking to something that you strongly relate to or resonate with, just like unmute your microphone or say something in the chat. And I think that way Corey or David or Sandy can intentionally make sure that you have a moment to say something. And with that, let me go ahead and share my screen. So this way, hopefully it doesn't sound too much like a little lecture. Okay, so I do want to kind of introduce the context that I come in with, and this isn't really just to like show off or anything. It's really to give you an idea of when I'm talking, what lens is it through, and what lived experience informs my expertise. Because I do think we do sometimes focus a little bit too much on degrees and traditional methods of recognizing expertise that sometimes devalues people's lived experience and interaction with systems of oppression. And I think I want to amplify that and say that even if you don't have, a certain degree or a certain job or a certain role in society, part of that also is that we exist under systems that aren't necessarily made for us. So besides my work, which is infectious diseases, I work on diagnosing infectious diseases. That's kind of where my specialty is. So right now, for example, it would be COVID testing. But I also started everything in terms of my learning with being a grassroots organizer at UCLA. And I think the only reason really COVID for me has been not as stressful of an experience in terms of my work has been because of student organizing. I picked up skills there that I wouldn't have otherwise. And other people that I know do not have that kind of experience going to college, specializing in things and being doctors, right? And I did, my major was microbiology, immunology, molecular genetics, as well as global studies. And besides that, in terms of like affinity spaces and things that I did that inform a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, my introduction, I would say, to grassroots organizing was definitely addressing the school to prison pipeline and mass incarceration from a framework of abolition. And that's kind of what really ignited my learning. And I'll talk a little bit about my background when I get off the slides so y'all have a little more context. But there's a reason my work is really, 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 really intersectional. So the school to prison pipeline and incarceration is very, very focused on Black and Brown communities in America. But I also was involved in the Students for Justice in Palestine, the Muslim Students Association, which are, extremely diverse communities of folks from different backgrounds all around the world. And I also did non-structured, non-student org spaces. So for example, we had a community space called Chai Talks, which specifically focused on South Asian social justice issues that was never a official student org, but was kind of like the space that we needed to bring our community together to actually just spend time together and talk about things that impacted us without always feeling like we have to, teach people. And I did dip in a lot of different segments of campus, which helped me, I think, interact with people that otherwise wouldn't have been in activism spaces. So I worked in UCLA campus tours, did a lot of research, also did some diversity inclusion work, which is how I interacted a lot with alumni affairs, and did some things here and there where I wanted to just try things out, right? Which I do encourage, I think, if you're still, involved in some sort of college space, to definitely do that. And I'm going to quickly stop sharing to, again, just for everyone, and again, feel free to share at any point if you resonate with this. But for me, my activism, I think, was something that I always felt. I don't think you don't just like become an activist overnight, right? Like people are activated over a course of their lifetime. And it's a culmination of everything that you've experienced. So I do want today to be very reflective. So everything that I'm going to be showing you, One, it's going to be unfiltered. That's one thing that I don't do. I can't water things down. And that's largely because I think I've had a very different perspective on what intersectionality is, right? And it's very non-US. So I'm an immigrant. I'm still not a US citizen. I came to America for college. Like UCLA was my first real like time that I spent here in the United States. But I was born in India, so I'm Afro-Indian, and that's again an intersectional identity because I'm half Muslim, half Hindu. So there kind of started my initial dynamics of understanding what oppression looks like, right? Religious minorities in India. And that allowed me to gain context also because, I was born, I guess, like treated like a girl from the as early age as I can remember, and that meant something, right? In our world today. So there were certain set expectations, certain way of things that I had to do, boxes I had to fit in, right, and labels that I had to take on. So I think that's another thing that I want to do today. Think about, what labels you've been taking on and how much of that is something that you would have done anyways and how much of that is you feeling like you have to identify as XYZ. And I definitely went through a growth phase of realizing how much of my identity was reactionary. And I think that will hopefully make more sense towards the end. And how much of my identity was like, oh, this feels natural because this is me. And that I think is like a lifelong evolutionary process. I don't actually think people just are like, this is me at any point. And I moved around after I left India. So I literally lived in different countries every 4 years or so. A lot of it was in the Middle East because of my parents' job. And I also lived in Russia. And so a lot of different geopolitical, historical contexts before I got to the United States. And I can still say race in the United States and oppression in the United States is very different and unique, even coming from the type of systems that I came from, right? And part of it is that there's a certain level of like systemic amnesia here. To me, that was very interesting. Where around the world, it was kind of like, this is what it is. And everyone, just understands what systems of oppression are. They, are benefiting from it. And it's kind of like we're loud about our bigotry, right? And here, that was actually the first cultural observation I made in the United States, that there was a amplification of intent over impact. And what that to me felt like was people would say that they were nice and they were really kind, but in practice, I wouldn't be seeing that as much. And I wouldn't see them actually being reflective about their role in causing harm, whether it was interpersonal or systemic, right? And that's what I mean by in other countries, people were very open about where they came from, right? And you could tell if they're willing to listen or not. And it was upfront. But here it's kind of like the act of portraying yourself as someone is very different than who you are on the inside. And that disconnect is like the first thing I learned about college. So that is essentially the first cage to me that I observed. And I say cage because partly a concept that I'm going to introduce today, hopefully not too much intellectual academic jargon, is abolition and abolitionist theory. And really, it's just both ideology and a framework, but also a goal and a vision, and also a way to like live. So it's not necessarily something that's going to happen like 60, 70 years. It's something that's already happening, right? And it's something that starts with you. And that's something a lot of people don't know, maybe because it's not broken down like that. Because sometimes I do think our movements are not accessible. I think we use a lot of fancy words that sometimes aren't really hitting at what everyone already knows, right? Which is that you have a sense that you've already done a lot in your life that doesn't feel right, that you just did because you had to, right? And you did because someone told you to, and that was the way to do it. And you were doing it and you were like, I'm not happy, but I'm just going to keep doing it because I have no choice, right? So abolition is literally not having to do that anymore. and having your sense of free will and time again to be able to do what you want and to not feel alienated and isolated, which is what also I observed the second thing about America, which is individualism, right? I come from a very collectivist society. So when we're talking about, types of different cultures, I think in general, cultures of resilience are, if you come from a marginalized community, whatever that is, right? Whether that's about your race, your ethnicity, any kind of identity, it's something that involves community resilience. And that's because you just can't fight alone, right? That's just not how it works. To be stronger, you just have to be together. So immigrant communities are inherently extremely collectivist. What that looks like in person is everyone's in each other's business. And, we know everyone down the street and everyone talks with each other, and our weddings are like 7,000 people. That's collectivism, but also on a larger scale, it's that your problem is my problem is your problem, right? And that again is interpersonal, and then it can build up to like systemic issues. So when people need help, mutual aid is an example of praxis. And again, praxis is just application of theory, right? So that's where you have impact over intent. So we can understand a bunch of political theory, but that doesn't really matter if we're not living it out in our daily lives. So mutual aid is an example of how collectivism can manifest. If your friend needs help, you're just like, you deserve help. I can give you help. This doesn't have to be transactional. I'm just going to help you. And that can be it, right? And that builds a culture of reciprocation and altruism where everyone kind of has a safety net, where they don't feel like if something happens, they're truly all on their own. And if we think about like violence and harm and oppression and what it comes from, a lot of it comes from alienation, feeling alone and feeling like you're invisible, right? So a lot of it is addressed by having a support system, like a genuine material support system, not just like, I'm here for you, but that doesn't mean anything, right? Which is another thing that's very American to me. I'm here for you, but I want to do something. And yeah, Corey, I think if you can go ahead, I want to just get a sense of where everyone's at right now in your life, and we're gonna do like 2 polls. So Corey, if you could just go ahead and do the first one. So this is kind of trying to assess what is your experience in, I guess, a very reductive way, but just gives us context of what kind of environment did you have, whether that's where you are now or in college. You can talk about before, past, present. It doesn't really matter. But I think if everyone could kind of do these, we're going to keep pulling these up intermittently to kind of get a assessment of how everyone's feeling, but also get your feedback. And Corey, does it just like pop up? I have no idea how this works. Because I always find these actually interesting. Okay. Cool. Okay, that's interesting. And I do think that this is something that's shifting now. So the idea is that hopefully you were doing something that involved both connecting with your community and doing college activism, which involves building solidarity and bridges across communities as well, right? And both have a unique impact. And I do think in some ways, both are in just like, you will not find that space again in that same manner, I think. And now, Corey, can you go ahead and do the second one? The other thing is, if you were involved in activism, I think a lot of times people prioritize their time differently based on what's important to them or what they've been told is important to them. So, what did you dedicate majority of your time to? And again, this is just if it's, a bunch of different things that you do, I guess whatever the greatest proportion is, whatever you cared about the most. Okay, hopefully we got some. Okay. So I think that actually tends to be what we kind of see a lot, which is a lot of people do focus, right, on what are your basic needs, which is how are you going to secure in your Maslow's hierarchy of needs, your shelter, your food, your water, and your basic safety, right, which is through academics and employment. But college is kind of the one space where sometimes that balance gets thrown off, and uniquely in a way that doesn't really happen a lot outside of college. So the 30% where I was actually going to say that I prioritized activism more than my academics. And that's interesting because, again, fundamentally, when you think about your Maslow's hierarchy of needs, sometimes that does involve a cost, what I call a fitness cost, which is essentially what are you giving up to focus on activism, right? And if your activism is then truly effective. And yeah, Tammy, based on your present or when you were a college student. So some of the questions I think are just about your job, you know, where you're at in life. So it doesn't have to be about college unless it's explicit. But I think a lot of people do dedicate time to activism sometimes where it's their primary like love and passion, and they really put a lot of themselves into it, right? And your energy goes into it, your labor goes into it, and that affects your mental health and your physical health and everything about you. And then it's like, what are you giving up, right? How are you focusing on your wellness? Are you focusing on your self-care? Are you taking care of your academics? So are you placing yourself in a position where you're going to have your basic needs met? And that's something I think I didn't ask myself enough in college until I got out and understood what systemic oppression really was, right? And how does systemic oppression work? And to really address systemic oppression by dismantling it, that I needed to focus on my academics. I needed to be able to build community at the same time, but I also could not necessarily dispose of one or the other, right? Because I needed to be in a position where I have more power. And that's something I think we understand, right? Power is really important when we understand like systemic racism and things like that. But in practice, we sometimes forget to look at ourselves, right? And this is something that we as human beings do. We always say we don't take our own advice. We like tell our friends we want the best for them and we don't take our own advice, right? So I didn't think about power a lot. Do I have the power right now to really change a system, right? I never asked myself that as much as I was driven by the need to want to change something, right? Which I think is genuine in college activism. I think we want to transform our communities. I think we want to bring radical change. But what we sometimes fail to do is assess what that looks like, right? Are we actually quantifying? Are we measuring if we're having an impact on our communities on the ground? And if so, does the next year look better than the year before? Because it should, right? Are we measuring our own impact on our bodies? Like, how healthy do you feel? How happy do you feel? How supported do you feel? What is the likelihood that you're going to leave college and feel like your needs are being met, right? And not have to give anything up because of something that you did in college. I think these assessment questions are something that we don't do enough. We sometimes think that we know what to do and we just run, right? And we don't really pause to think about all of the racial equity tools that are out there to actually ask ourselves these questions and evaluate if we're meeting our basic needs. I'm going to share my screen again. So this is a little bit getting back to a little bit more theory again. And Corey already put in the community space guidelines. And I wanted to add a couple things to it. Don't read it if you don't want to. Really, just this is a communal space. So first and foremost, we're going to be talking about issues that are very communal, right? That are community oriented and are also individual and personal. And I think both are valid and both are really important to remember how you feel and how your community feels, right? Because those are connected. And also, don't be bothered if you feel uncomfortable around a particular issue. I actually recommend if there's a particular topic that I talk about that like ignites some kind of discomfort in you, that's probably something that's potential for like a revolutionary moment where you can understand something crucial and it can catalyze a lot of growth. So I would actually write that down like on notes on your phone or something. And don't at any point worry about like defending, institutions, right? Because people are really the focus of everything that we do. So the first thing I want to come like outright and say is one, it's a growing process to like be an activist, and it's something that you kind of work towards your entire life. I think activism is a journey, and being anti-racist, I think, isn't a goal. It's just like we're fixing ourselves a little bit every time we do something, right? So, but the first role is to definitely acknowledge that we are ourselves upholding oppression, all of us, to varying degrees, right? And upholding oppression is also fundamentally different than being a person or being responsible for a system of oppression, for constructing it and profiting from it and actively, strengthening it to exploit others, right? So a lot of us are complicit, but acknowledging our own actions and our role is like the first step to really understanding how we are actually important and how the power that currently lies with systems and institutions does actually lie with people. Because the moment people say this is done, this is enough, that's when historically oppression has been, upturned. So it's okay to, yourself undergo oppression, right? And also be involved in oppression, because that's just life, right? So I want to not emphasize this whole feeling of happy endings and positivity. I think that can only come when there's justice. And positivity, a lot of times, is just the journey of like towards liberation, right? It's the journey towards building community and being free. So again, this is just basic concepts I think everyone might know to some extent, but systemic oppression manifests on an individual level. So within ourselves, between each other, and structural and institutional. And each of us goes through different systems and are experiencing harm from different systems. And all of that is pretty important. So it's intersectional. But when we mean institutions of oppression, what do we talk about? Because I think we use a lot of words in progressive spaces that sometimes we don't define. But really, institutions of oppression are every single social system in society, right? In America or any European colonial context, because it can be leveraged to harm certain communities. And this is just a fact, right? This isn't necessarily a personal opinion, but America is a country that was built on indigenous genocide and expanded via exploitation of Black communities that were brought literally here, stolen from the shores of Africa, right? That is the foundation that we're currently standing on. And that first system of slavery was an example of full-fledged, what we call racial capitalism. So racism is oppression based on race. Capitalism is a system of economy. But what I hope to get through is that fundamentally, it's that the system that we're existing in is racial capitalism, both like nationally and globally, where Black and Brown communities and bodies are actively exploited in economic systems for profit, right? And the first explicit system is slavery. But also, America is not decolonized. It's not free. It's not independent, even though we have July 4th, right? Because the land belongs to indigenous folks and they still don't have sovereignty over their land. So the process of decolonization is trying to get closer and closer to that goal, right? Where we here are guests on indigenous land and we're able to return to those roots. So in that context, every system that we exist in is technically a system of oppression, right? So every system that we currently have, from education, healthcare, carceral systems, economic systems, the media, government, they were all created by the people that founded this country, right? So they were created for the people that founded this country. And I think that's like a basic concept that we can, all kind of agree on. Since then, some of these systems have evolved, but they're still inherently colonial systems that were created by white supremacists that were extremely wealthy, right? So not working class folks. And reforming a system with roots of oppression does not actually really change anything, because it's just reformed to be more palatable. So when we talk about slavery, it just went from being very explicit to occurring in prisons, right? So even the most explicit forms of harm that we think of, like Jim Crow segregation, that just went from being explicit to now looking like what residential segregation looks like in urban cities. So one thing we need to acknowledge is already we kind of know and have a feeling that whatever we live in just doesn't work, right? And that's because the proof of that is quite literally right now, COVID, right? That has obviously, as any disaster, targeted Black and Brown communities, Indigenous communities, poor folks, working class communities the hardest, right? And that's because any kind of violence, right, does exacerbate already existing social inequity. And any kind of identity based system, right, and a lot of these identities again are social constructs, right? Race is a social construct, gender is a social construct. All of those are then leveraged to fit a certain framework of oppression. So when we're talking about oppression, again, the key word I think is power, right? Power is the most important word because who has power says a lot about what we're living under, right? And right now, there's certain contexts I think that people are understanding that the reason that COVID is such a mess isn't because our healthcare system is just a failure, or our public health system is just a failure, or our government is in fact just a failure. No, right? Like it's everything, and changing people in and out doesn't necessarily dismantle that system of oppression, right? Because that power still exists, that power dynamic that allowed someone to exist and take advantage of that system and use that to oppress people still is there. So again, that's something to remember. I think that a lot of the oppression, it's so hard to get rid of, right? And we always wonder, why is it so hard to just get rid of these like terrible, terrible, terrible social facets that we created, right? Like systemic racism. It's because there's incentive to keeping them, right? So when we talk about racism, capitalism is really the root of a lot of oppression because it makes it profitable from all these systems, right? From racism, which manifests like the prison industrial complex, to healthcare, which prioritizes profits over people. So it's kind of impossible to separate the two, right? Because they wouldn't be born without each other around the world or in America. And another thing I think that helps me understand this is we have to be gentle with ourselves when we think about violence and harm and oppression, right? Because harm is externalized. That's one way it can be done, but it can also be internalized, right? And internalized harm is also a product of intergenerational oppression. In one way, that can look like something like internalized hate, right? Internalized sexism, like colorism, internalized racism, like colorism, where darker skinned folks are treated worse in communities and societies than lighter skinned folks, right? Even within communities of color. But it can also look like what do people in benefiting from a system of oppression have to go through to get to the point where they are, where they justify oppression, right? And they benefit from it, they enforce it, they perpetuate it, and they internalize the superiority complex. And a lot of it is because they have themselves been conditioned and socialized, right? To be able to live like that and act like that and exist within these systems of power, control, and economics, right? So power, control, and capitalism. And without acknowledging both sides, right, the oppressor and the oppressed, and how a lot of times all of us are fluctuating in all of these roles. Like I'm actively paying taxes, just like many of us, to the state of to this, to this country, and that in itself is a form of oppression, right? Because I don't have control over where my money goes, and a lot of it does go to oppressed communities. So something important is to be kind with individuals and remember that we don't exist in vacuums as people, right? We're a product of socialization and community and systemic influences. And I love the word, the phrase, it takes a village, but I don't like how it's not used consistently, because it does take a village when a person grows and succeeds, but also when a person commits harm, right? So when they commit an act of violence, that also takes a village. And therefore, addressing that harm doesn't just involve holding a person accountable. You have to include the community accountable and hold the systems that cause that kind of harm accountable as well. So that kind of shows us that violence is contextual, right? So it emerges in certain conditions. And if those conditions don't exist, we don't actually know if that person would be still committing that harm. And if we do look at data and look at research, actually it shows that once you're meeting people's material needs, right? So if they're not poor, if they're able to access education, if they're able to access healthcare better, that does in fact dramatically reduce violence because they no longer need to use and rely on any kind of oppressive dynamics to be able to get their basic needs met. So again, something that's important in the context of decolonization is what is legal and illegal is again defined by the systems that were created that weren't created to be, for indigenous communities, right? So don't rely overly on that for yourself to decide what's good and bad, right? And again, this is where I talk about impact over intent. Niceness doesn't necessarily equate with being just or ethical, right? So observe people's actions. And I'm going to stop quickly again so we can do a poll. Corey, could you do the third and fourth? I'll stop sharing. And I want everyone to be like honest because we don't see your answers. They're anonymous, so you can literally say whatever you want. Okay. Let's just see what we got. Okay, that's kind of what I expected. And I think I'll keep the numbers in mind and let's do the next one. I think this is kind of a crucial follow-up. Okay. Oops. Okay. So we don't have a large sample size. So given how significant these results are, I think you can imagine if we had, 100 people here, 1,000 people here, what these numbers would look like and what the p-value would look like, right? Statistically. And this is what I mean by sometimes you don't need the academic intellectual jargon to be able to talk about social justice, because a lot of times it just needs you sitting down and actually asking yourself, are you happy? And if not, then why are you not happy? Right? And then asking, what does my community look like? And what do I identify as like problems? And where do those problems actually come from? Like, what is the root? Right? Not how am I going to punish this person, but like, what is the root of problems? And that's because addressing the root is actually how you implement permanent change, right? And prevent violence from emerging. So from that snapshot, I think we can tell that like pretty much everyone, if you didn't know when you came here that capitalism sucks, I think, I'm sorry, but like that's that's the consensus here pretty much, that a lot of us are feeling, right? If we're honestly, we're very lucky to be in places that we think that we're either doing exactly what we want to do or feeling like we're being compensated for what we are doing. And both of those, I think, are kind of like in flux. But in general, right, we don't really have free will, right? And in general, we don't really get to spend as much time with our families as we want to. We don't get to spend as much time with our community as we want to. And we definitely don't take care of our health enough. I think that's like everything agrees on. Everyone says that their whole life, right? We just age saying that and then we die. Or we're like, I should take care of my health. I should take care of my health. I should be more happy. And then we die. So I think, where does that come from, right? If every single person is saying that, independent of, your identity, independent of your experience, right? And even though there's intersectional harm, like where does that come from then, right? It's the systems that we exist in that make us feel so powerless, even though you're not, right? Even though you do have agency to decide what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. The act of feeling powerless in itself is so incapacitating, and sometimes feels like, even wanting to change something is a lost cause, right? Even though that's factually not accurate, because every single system ever in like history of this, like, I wouldn't say country, even of the planet, that has ever been dismantled to construct something that's more equitable, right? Simple dynamics are my own country being decolonized, actually decolonized, right? And kicking out the British Empire. that process came really when people decided to say, we're powerful. I don't really care, what power you have over us because we decide who stays on our land, right? And I think realizing your own individual and your community power comes from being together is like the first thing in college that is something that we learn when we're around our support system, right? Whatever it is. And quickly, Corey, time check. I'm seeing the time. Are we like able to go like a little bit over? Okay, thanks. And at any point, people can feel free to leave. I'm gonna quickly go back to a little bit of theory and then come back to a couple of polls. So when we think about blame, this is why I talk about being kind with yourself, because a lot of us are, quite frankly, we think maybe some of us are middle class, but we're not. Because the way we define middle class is, do you have, if you go through a big disaster, personal disaster, right? Like a health crisis or COVID, are you going to come out the other end with no problems? Because that's what middle class looks like, genuinely. And that doesn't exist anymore, right? Because each of us are pretty much one health crisis away from being homeless, to be honest. And majority of people, therefore, fall under working class or poor. And the top 1% are wealthy and elite, right? And those are the people running systems and are benefiting from systems and are actually just profiting from them without really experiencing harm. And everyone else is experiencing some level of harm, right? And it fluctuates depending on exactly what intersection you're at. So, therefore, I think sometimes we misdirect a lot of our anger and target the wrong, not the wrong system, but target the wrong place in society when we're looking for accountability, right? Because punishing a oppressor, as in a single person, doesn't necessarily abolish oppression itself, right? So, how do we address the dynamic of being a oppressor ourselves, right? And being oppressed as well. And that's really with leading with compassion, right? And understanding that everyone is a combination and accumulation of their social conditioning. So, what happens when we change that dynamic is we start to look at oppression in a way that we can prevent it instead of just reacting to it, right? Which is something a lot of college activism does, right? Like something happens in the world. Perfect example being Trump, right? And then you just find yourself having to react to this thing this whole time. And a lot of times it's not even something that is benefiting your community because it's not even harming your community as much as like poverty is and homelessness is, or the healthcare system is, right? In just a clear like toll, right, that it takes on your communities. But you react to it in a way like it's a most immediate crisis with this level of energy and labor you're putting in that's not proportional to the outcome, right? So that's what draws us into the idea of abolition, which is to imagine a world beyond whatever we currently exist in. Because if we've acknowledged that we don't feel okay internally, that we're looking at oppression around us and we realize that there's social inequity around us, that therefore there has to be a world beyond. And it's not just, hypothetical and unrealistic and just thinking of, oh, I'm just going to, tomorrow end police and prisons and just move on with my life, right? It's about actually living your life in a way where you can make that happen on a personal level, right? So within your mind first, being able to realize that it's okay to let go of certain things that we've been taught from a young age, right? Something as simple as like, I'm a woman, and all this stuff that is associated with that word is somehow biological when it's not, right? It's not a real biological construct in that I don't have a natural need to nurture, right? I'm totally fine with focusing on myself and my community and my career, right? And race, for example, we think in the context of healthcare that some communities are inherently sicker. Sure, Black Americans are more likely to have higher rates of diabetes, but it's not because of race, it's because of racism, right? So liberating ourselves from those cages leads us to actually have the power to dismantle actual cages like prisons and ICE and the military, right? So it's something that we go beyond a metaphor for. And like I said, it's not just the ending of something, it's the building of something else at the same time, right? So if you are going to take down our existing healthcare system, which is, built on capitalism, right? So profit driven over people driven, And it focuses on literally being reactionary, right? So COVID happens and then we scramble, right? But we don't pour money into public health, which actually addresses the conditions in which bad health emerges in the first place, which is poverty, homelessness, inequity, incarceration, toxins, right? In your water, in your air. So we don't address those things. We just react, right? But if we construct systems of equity and community support, then we can actually abolish this type of healthcare and create universal healthcare, right? Where everyone actually has the right to live. Because I think that's something we don't realize, but currently in the United States, you don't actually have the right to life because that requires you to have the right to go get care whenever you want, however you want, without earning it, right? So you don't actually have the right to life. You have to earn the right to live. So that's what abolition really seeks to do, which is not blame social problems, right? Which is like interpersonal violence, systemic violence, on just taking a person and putting them in a cage and isolating them and putting them at the fringes of society, because that doesn't really solve anything. And problems that we look at sometimes as quote unquote not okay and forms of violence, we need to kind of take away from that and say that homelessness, unemployment, drug addiction, mental health issues, all of these are problems that really need to be dealt with if we're going to really, really, really move beyond the existing state of society, right? Cages don't really help. So in practice, so that's what theory is, right? But what does that look like in the real world? And that's what I think is a perfect example of this wave. I'm going to say, I wouldn't say the Black Lives Matter movement is anything that's even 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years old, right? It's something that's been happening in cycles over and over again. Because prison and police are both systems that were created, like police, the predecessor to police departments were slave patrols that were created to literally have the function of capturing escaped slaves, right? And that's what we're starting with. Prisons were literally created to take a bunch of like modern prison systems to take free people in the South and then put them to work to rebuild the South, right? So that's the foundation that we're building on. And you can't really reform that, right? So why abolition, not reform? Because you can't reform something if your goal is to just strengthen that system and keep it there. That's not how that works, right? So you're working towards taking that system away. So an example of a good reform, right? I do think there's good reforms as long as you know what the end goal is. You can't just it's kind of like college, right? You can't take a class if you don't know what major you're going to leave with, right? What's the point? So you need to know what some sort of end goal you're working towards is. So defunding the police is taking away money from police departments, right? Which is something that can happen at the city council level, and redirecting it into communities, right? By funding communities and improving systems of safety, right? So housing, investing in care, so healthcare, mental health, social work, and not using cops to respond to problems that don't really, make sense for them to respond to, right? And eventually what it is the idea of taking away the power of certain systems of harm to give power to certain systems of community where people are uplifted, where they themselves are no longer in conditions, social conditions where violence emerges, right? Often I think we don't think about where words like ghetto emerge from without thinking about what does that actually look like in real life, right? And if you happen to be someone who's experienced that, then what does that look like for you to come from that community, right? And to know that your family members are experiencing harm, right? And your community is experiencing harm. And moving beyond harm doesn't just involve taking those people and putting them somewhere else, right? Because their oppression is still there, whether it's in their body, in their mind, or within each other, right? Because where does interpersonal conflict emerge from? Even an argument at work often is a culmination of two people probably having a lot of problems in their life that are stemming from some sort of oppressive system, right? And if such oppressive system did not exist, and a lot of times it's just capitalism, right? Because you're stressed with work and you're forced to feel like you have to compete all the time, right? With each other, with people you probably want to cooperate with, collaborate with. And it doesn't even feel natural to some extent, maybe to compete. And that's because it's not, right? Human instinct is the opposite, where we're built to be together and cooperate and build societies. That's literally what animals in general are meant to do, right? So competition feels a little odd. And the source of that is capitalism, where you're told that, this is the market and the market is like free when it's really not, right? So if you're a person who's Black or brown or, not a cis male, white male, your dynamics and where you're starting off is very different, right? On the market. And therefore, it's not a free market at all, right? So there's already inequity, and that's like you're born into inequity, right? By default, without a choice, without you doing a single thing in your life, you already are starting off on a different playing field than someone else. And then you're told you have to compete for resources. And I think what we don't realize is how all of us, if we're all some sort of working class or poor, then we're all fighting for crumbs, right? We're told that the American dream is like working and doing the right thing and getting an education. And then you're going to have this beautiful, mansion and a car and a white picket fence. And that's really not something that looks like power, right? Because power in this country is the top 1%, right? The people that actually create systems and benefit from them and profit from them and strengthen them and have the power to expand them, right? Which the average Joe just does not, right? And we think we have agency when we do things like vote, but even voting is like something that we do every 4 years that is still working within the same framework of what the Electoral College, right, which was created to disenfranchise Black folks in the South and to not allow Indigenous folks to vote at all. So that's the context that we're working in. So I think it's always important to like question yourself and think about if I'm doing something, even if it's college activism or if it's in my community, where this is just self-introspective questions that I wrote down, and we'll send out a PowerPoint after, so y'all have this. And before I ask these, Corey, can we put up the next question? Okay, let's see what that looks like. This is like, I feel like ooh. Actually, I said sometimes too, because it's kind of hard to think about, right? And Corey, actually, can we do 7 first and then 6? So I know a lot of people describe their, career / job, or even if you're in college, then what are you, whatever you're working towards, right? In many different ways. Just go with your instinct, like whatever the first thing is. Okay, I'm actually excited for this. Interesting. Okay. So it's a 3-way tie between income, passion, and serving a societal purpose or community. Okay. And I think that's actually important, because ideally what we think about is we want to be doing something, one, obviously, that we're good at, right? But also something that is fulfilling and has some sort of impact, right? Isn't just something that we're doing that we're like, I don't know why I'm doing this exactly, but I need to make this flyer right now, tomorrow, at this time. I'm really stressed. I don't really know where it's going, who's benefiting from it. I'm just going to do it because I need this much dollars an hour, right? That's like not what, benefit to society looks like, right? Even if you sometimes know that down the line, somehow it's going to work, like, are you seeing the impact of your work, like in real time, right? And a lot of us don't have that luxury. And I think for me, it was something that was really important, that my priority was like, am I serving community? But that also meant if I am living under capitalism within other systems of oppression, right, like immigration and everything that exists, and including systemic racism, that I have to give up something, because you can't, in this current structure of society, do something that is fulfilling and also something that makes you really happy and also something that gives you enough money to survive. That's just too much you're asking for, right? And you're told you're ungrateful because you're asking for like literally like these are our basic needs. And I think we kind of deny them a lot, right? Feeling happy is told that it's like oh, it's just something that we like aspire to. That's like a far away, unreachable thing. When in fact, feeling happy is fundamental to being a productive member of society, right? And feeling connected to your community, feeling like you're doing something that's important, and being good at it is really, really, really something that comes from feeling fulfilled, right? And I think I had to give up on what, like, my job, infectious diseases, is one of the most underpaid specialties in medicine, right? Because medicine is, again, profit driven. So surgeons, plastic surgeons, neurosurgeons, dermatologists get paid more, right? Even though the total impact in society, like right now, the most important medical specialty is infectious diseases, right? But we're not paid proportionally to societal impact. So I had to give something up to be able to do something that I like or want, or has a benefit. And the reflection questions that I think, and just to give everyone an example of what they look like. So to think about, and after this, we have one more poll, and then we'll just do like any Q&A for folks. What is the purpose of the activism that you're doing, right? If it's in college or if it's in the community, like what are you actually doing it for? And actually sitting with it and writing things down, right? Is it decolonizing the system or space that you are working towards, right? So is it something that you know for sure is impactful? And if you do know it's impactful, right? So if you're saying that I'm going to put on an initiative, right, like diversity inclusion initiative, because it sounds like it's something that could be beneficial, sure. But how do you know it worked, right? How do you know it actually helped someone? And that's where like getting feedback from your community and quantifying and assessing impact is extremely important, right? So constantly evaluating community needs is something that we don't do because we presume we know what people are going through. And I don't think we understand to what extent we actually presume that on a day-to-day. Like, we think we know what marginalized people go through. We think we know people that are incarcerated, what their needs are. We think we know what Indigenous folks want. But when's the last time we talked to someone that, has a felony on their record, right? When's the last time you talked to a homeless person? Like actually talk to them and ask them what they needed, right? And did they say, I want Trump out of office? Okay, so if not, did you meet their basic needs? Right? Because until their basic needs are met, they can't care about anything else, right? They can't care about what's on the news. They can't care about other things that are going on because they're not eating, they don't have shelter, right? And if you have a felony on your record, you can't vote. You probably shouldn't have ever even, been in prison in the first place. No one should be in prison, but you literally were, involved in an unjust system, right? And this is where a lot of my UCLA activism was useful, because since I started with activism that included not just advocating for people, because there's a certain power dynamic there too, right? That we don't acknowledge, where we presume we know what communities want, even though we personally might be not experiencing that exact form of harm. And we rely overly on identity politics, right? Which is something in college I thought to be a good thing, right? Where I thought it was enough to say that I want our student government president to be someone who's Black or brown or who's queer. But at the end of the day, again, are we evaluating impact over intent, right? So sure, our intent is to have someone who has experienced certain levels of oppression and is able to, address that kind of harm, to be in that position, right? But also, should that kind of position of power exist in the first place, right? Should that power be something that stems from one person, or should it be decentralized where a community, a group of people have that kind of power, right? And where is the system of accountability? So if this person isn't meeting community needs, how exactly does that work, right? And if they are then in that position, what did that look like the first time someone with a marginalized identity was in that position? What was the outcome of that? Are you quantifying if your community genuinely had improved outcomes? And in college, that looks like, did your community, like for me, it was the Muslim community, right? Did my community have improved graduation rates? Did they have higher chances of ending up in graduate school if that was their career path? Did they have better outcomes? Did even something as simple as where was their mental wellness at? Was that even improved from one year to the next, right? And to be honest, whenever we genuinely did that, it didn't matter. It genuinely didn't matter, because people kept living under the same systems, and changing people around doesn't exactly get rid of harm, right? It kind of just makes it more palatable. And sometimes we don't question that enough, right? Because that's not sustainable. Because the moment that person's gone, right, even if they are a really good person, the moment that person is gone, you're still having that system in place where someone else can go in there and then continue and exacerbate oppression. So what's the point, right? If we're not really working towards abolition and not like we're uncomfortable saying the word abolition, right? And I couldn't imagine, because I was at UCLA when we went through the cycle of uprisings that involved Trayvon and Mike Brown and divestment and um, Sandra Bland. And I remember vividly, right? People thinking of all of these reforms, right? Like no knock warrants. And a lot of them involved increasing funding to police departments to get them body cams and diversity training and things like that, right? But how often, because that harm was already quantified, there was already existing research that had at that point already shown that increasing funding to police departments does not actually, fix significant problems, right? Because we still have police violence. So I think that's some self-evaluation questions that are really, really important to ask yourself almost on a daily basis, if not at the very least when you're planning something with your community or in college at any level of activism. Even if your work is activism, right? Ask yourself if I'm really doing it for the type of impact that I think it should have, right? And how much do I really know about the impact? Because I think I presumed a lot of things, to be honest, in college. And that's like my biggest like last thing that I want to say, that a lot of the things that I presumed was that radical activism looks a certain way, right? To me, it was like radical activism looks like not giving, any not having a care in the world and just going for it and like putting yourself out there and putting yourself on the line. Okay, but I was a kid, right? I'm a visibly Black and brown woman. I'm Muslim. I'm an immigrant. I've already been subject to state violence and state surveillance. I'm not a citizen, right? So I don't have a lot of safety support once anything happens, right? So why am I out there on the front lines? Why aren't someone else who have more support systems of safety, right? Something as simple as being a citizen is a mile above me, right? In case something happens when it comes to like something as simple as a protest, right? And if you organize in grassroots activism, that's why grassroots activism is, to me, the only real form of activism, because activism isn't just reading books about racism and being like, okay, cool, like I feel, really empowered. Okay, but how do you know you're doing right? How do you know you're evolving? That only comes with community accountability, right? And that only happens when you're around people who are constantly like holding you accountable to something. Your community is holding you accountable, right? In big and small ways. And a protest, I think, is like a beautiful example of what that looks like, right? There's front of the line, there's sidelines, there's back of the line, there's a purpose. If there is a protest that's organized by grassroots organizers, there's a clear purpose to that, right? There's always a clear goal. And the people that are at the front of the line should not be like, for example, Black men. It shouldn't be Black men, right? Because those are the first to experience harm and violence in the event that they're interacting with law enforcement, right? So even if it's me and someone else who's a visible, perceived threat, perceived other, more so than me, I'm going to put myself in front of them, right? And I think that's something we don't think about enough. Leveraging our position in society to do the most we can, right? And the most you can do in college, the most you can do even in grad school, the most you can do early stages of your career is building yourself up first, right? Making sure you're good and your basic needs are met, right? And that includes your mental health, your physical health. You feel supported by your community, right? You've navigated your family dynamics if you have intergenerational trauma that you need to unpack. So go to therapy, right? And get yourself to get to a place where you love yourself and care about yourself enough to love others and care about others enough, right? Because until you really get to the point where you believe you deserve to feel better, you deserve to live a life of like happiness, and that's not a huge expectation. You deserve to eat, you deserve to sleep, you deserve to feel loved, right? These are all literally basic needs. And that's when you start to realize, okay, if I look at a homeless person, I'm no longer going to look at them as someone who's violent, who's capable of harm, who shouldn't be there just because it's illegal to sleep on a park bench, right? Because I deserve better. Therefore, they deserve better. And the reason that I have better is because I was given better by my community, right? It took a lot of people to get you where you are, and they probably did not have that, right? And if they didn't have that, then it's our collective responsibility to make sure they do have that. And unless we're providing someone with everything that they need to have the social conditions to be happy, like genuinely happy and fulfilled, we can't possibly think that caging someone and putting individual responsibility on one single person is going to actually resolve any violence or harm. It's only going to exacerbate it and get this person who probably is not responsible for harm alone, right? Probably isn't even the biggest factor, right? They're probably like 5% of the responsibility of the harm that they caused, right? A lot of them probably comes from how they were abused by other people, right? How they were treated when they were young. What system are they living under, right? And you're not doing, like, we're not able to do anything about that, right? So until we do focus on that first, before we focus on like expanding punitive justice, then that's when we begin to like realize that we value ourselves enough to give others that same dignity. And with that, I want to end with like one final poll, and then for, just do Q&A casually. And I think this is something that I hope leads into like a conversational Q&A. So there's no bounds, like literally a perfect world, whatever you envision liberation to look like, right? Internal, external. Okay, yeah. And I think like it combined, a lot of people are basically like, no, kind of, I don't really know, which is probably a no. So I think that's the point. Is what would our society look like if we're just looking at the poll results where most people said yes, right? Like, what does that society look like? And what does our society look like right now? Which is, it's dramatically different, right? If people are happy and doing something they care about, that society looks very different. And that can only happen when you're no longer subject to systemic oppression, when you're no longer feeling like you have to generate profit for like the top 1% and be part of like this giant production line, right? Where your value is inherently undervalued, right? Your worth as a human being is constantly devalued because you're told you're only worth as much as you produce. That's literally how this works, right? And even something as simple as minimum wage is a sham because like Florida just voted for a minimum wage of $15, but that's not going to be actualized until much later. And by then, the value of what that $15 is no longer what $15 really is right now. Right. So that's why if you've like thought about the minimum wage struggle, that's been like the oldest struggle in this country, right? That people have always been fighting for, because it doesn't matter. Like it's like a goalpost that keeps moving, right? And why? Because the system of hyperinflation and capitalism still exists, right? So what's the point of fighting for a minimum wage when literally that minimum wage is going to mean a little bit of nothing tomorrow? So I think the last thing that I think we all need to think about, and I think about it, and it made me feel better when I thought about it, is when I got out of college, the first thing I asked myself is if I had spent more time on my wellness, on my mental health, on doing what feels good, like just doing what feels good, because it didn't feel good a lot of times to do some of the types of activism that I did that involved putting myself on the line, right? That involved like going up against like white supremacist systems, feeling powerless and feeling like I didn't have a support net. And what would I be doing if I didn't actually do that? Because the cost of that was a lot of mental health trauma and physical trauma to me, to the point where I couldn't even think about doing alumni things 5 years until 5 years after, right? Until I had healed. And the idea is maybe I would have been in a healthier place. Maybe I would have, been a little bit ahead in my career and had a little bit more, a little bit more wealth that I could then redistribute, right? That I could then give back to my community. And that is directly a quantification of increased impact. So I was able to think about that and realize that I organized with people that left college, right? That in college were student government like leaders, right? Really important people in our community that left and didn't have jobs, that spent 4 years trying to figure out what they were going to do with their life, right? Because so much of their energy in college was directed towards, or grad school was directed towards, just trying to react to certain things, right? That you felt like you just were obliged to react to without evaluating really whether you had to do this, right? And what is the point? And why are they doing this, right? And is this the biggest system of harm really? Or am I looking at something else? Because I genuinely realized that that was income, right? One, that person didn't make income, right? But also, that also means that they didn't give back to their own community. So that was, you could basically put a dollar sign on exactly how much money was out of the community, right? And out of the hands of people that needed it. Because that's what collectivist communities do, right? We give back. The first thing that I did with my first paycheck is I donated a part of it, right? Like we do this early on. We don't wait till we're like making six figures. So that also means every moment that you're not in a place where your basic needs are being met and you don't feel like you're fulfilled, there is a direct harm to yourself and your community. So to me, radical activism now means being selective about what I do, evaluating it very carefully, my impact carefully, right, rather than my intent, and never doing reform unless it involves weakening a system of power, right? Never strengthening institutions, right? And if I feel like I need to do something within an institution, it doesn't have to be reacting to white supremacy or sexism, which is half the time what I felt like I was doing, right? Educating others. Why not just have like a healing circle for your community? Why is that so bad, right? Why do we have to keep doing teach-ins and workshops for others? Why not just have a career development workshop for your community, just for your community, right? Why is that so wrong? And why do we deprioritize that so much as opposed to putting on like student government elections and putting our weight behind them, or like resolutions in student government, right? Because the impact on the ground of having one person connect to someone else and just get a good letter of rec, something as simple as that, get a good reference, right? Get an older alumni from that org to like hire you for an internship, is exponentially larger than certain initiatives we did, entire initiatives, right? Just one person getting an internship. So like think about that the next time you feel obliged to do certain things. How much of that is really you wanting to do it and needing to do it, and how much of that is a system telling you you should do it and literally distracting you from what you should really be doing. And with that, I want to thank Patricia, Corey, David, Sandy. Thank you so much again for like having me, and for the folks that are still here. I'm sorry we went like hell overtime, but hopefully it was beneficial to some degree. And if you want to kind of pop in and say what you felt, questions, or just like express yourself, your reflection, I think that would be kind of awesome for all of us. And popcorn, just like go for it.
Yeah, folks, feel free to put yourself off mute if you want to just have a conversation, or if you have a quick question.
Yeah, or if anything particularly resonated with you, I think it's important to like call it out and let people know that like you vibe with it too.
I really liked how you offered a lot of like reflective questions, because I feel like that's something I kind of like overlook, is I'll just kind of like go through like motions almost, or I'll kind of like follow what other people are doing necessarily, which I think is a good thing at times. But I think having that like self-reflective perspective is like really important. So thank you for those questions. And then I guess I do kind of have a question as far as like, because of this like very isolating time, how are you navigating, or like how have you seen like what's been an effective way to like create community and also like join communities, because like we can't really be in person and be in connection with people the way we are used to.
Yeah, and I think that's why partly this time has been incredibly difficult. And I think we're actually going to have a lot of research studies that truly evaluate what isolation does to people, right? And I kind of love this because it's kind of like beautiful, like irony, because this is like extreme individualism, right? We're literally unable to connect with someone we care about. And there's no like monetary benefit or anything from that, right? It's just like we're not able to be around them technically, physically, just literally like in proximity. And what does that do to like communities? What does that do to relationships? What does that do to jobs? What does that do to the economy? What does that do to something as simple as your mental health? And I think it's going to be like one of those like impacts on like the human race that's going to be just like this massive societal understanding of like, oh, this is why I need to like not, think about myself all the time, because I was by myself, right? That's what I realized first, and I hated it. And I like didn't feel like there was any purpose. Like what am I aspiring to? What am I doing if I'm just alone doing something, right? What is success? What is money? Like I started asking these questions I probably asked like when I was like a kid, right? Because now I have like little kids that ask me these questions. It's like, why is the sky blue? And I actually realized those are really good questions if we like give them the time of day, because being a kid is probably the last time I had this level of introspection where I was like, why am I here? Right? But really, why am I here? And like now it's kind of like a big circle where we come back to it and you're like, oh God, why am I here? So I think building community for me has actually looked like turning inward, because I believe a lot of harm comes from the fact that we spend a lot of time externalizing, right? Whether that's externalizing our like whatever feelings we feel inside and projecting, or something like externalizing oppression, right? So using power to like put it on press someone else. But something as simple as like, if you're called out and you get really defensive, right? And you're like, I didn't do that. Like, that's not true, because I'm nice. I'm a good person, right? That's also externalizing, because you're always putting the accountability on someone else, and you're never asking yourself what your role in interpersonal violence is, or interpersonal harm or systemic harm is. So I think I honestly have had like massive growth I would have probably never had without like this particular time, because I started to, one, question why I'm even doing certain things that I'm doing, right? Like, what is the purpose and who tells me to do it and who's benefiting from it? Like, am I really benefiting from it, or is someone else benefiting from my labor, right? Whether it's emotional labor, physical labor, whatever it is, right? Because emotional labor is something we don't think about, right? Reproductive labor, like those are all forms of labor that are actually not valued by capitalism, right? But are under socialism, because that doesn't quantify product, right? We don't focus on what you produce. We focus on what is your actual human impact in society, right? So someone like musicians and artists would actually have a ton of value, because their like net impact is massive, right? Even though what they're not producing is like not an iPhone, right? So I think it started to make me think about people differently, like who's important, who's not. I think essentiality, the word essential worker, has really transformed our understanding of like what jobs are. Like sanitation workers are paid nothing, but at the same time, I don't know, someone working for like, I don't know, like a publicity group, literally just to brand something to look like something for capitalism to make profits, they themselves have no clear idea why the hell they're doing this, right? Are paid so much more than like the backbone of society, which is like reproductive labor, which is literally unpaid, right? Domestic work is unpaid and just presumed to be relegated to like whoever we associate as like the feminine, gendered like woman in that dynamic, right? So it's like, how much of the crucial, essential, super important labor are we actually valuing? And who is making the millions, right? Like, do I really need my toothbrush to arrive in the mail tomorrow? Or can I just like walk my butt to Walgreens and get it myself? Because that's why Amazon exists, right? So what is our sense of urgency? Where does that actually come from? Because capitalism urges that time, right? That's what productivity is. Like, you got to get this done tomorrow for no reason, just do it. And if we wake up and just like feel really nice and go to sleep, we wake up the next day and we're like, God damn it, I wasn't productive. Well, okay. And, and I'm huge on that, right? Like my whole life, I had been feeling like I had to achieve something to be valuable, right? And to offer something like concrete material. And otherwise, I would never be someone that was loved and appreciated, right? Genuinely, like that's not even value monetarily, right? Loved. And so honestly, COVID got me to ask inside, wait, why do I have such a low sense of self-worth? why do I feel like I can't sleep unless I get something done? Because like technically I could get it done whenever the hell I want, right? So why am I arbitrarily setting this like timeline for myself? And then I was like, wait, because my entire life, my mother told me you know what I mean? Like, then I just started unpacking my entire like childhood trauma, right? And I figured out that I have like complex PTSD, and whatever I went through as a kid was like not okay, right? And until I acknowledged that, I wouldn't be able to even like who I am, right? So I felt like I was an imposter when I used to be in activism like environments, because I was like telling people to like love themselves and I didn't like genuinely like myself, right? So it's like, this is like how I think we build community, because instead of always looking for people, you need to first feel whole and complete on your own, right? Like it's the same thing that I said, you need to like yourself and love yourself and believe that you deserve happiness. You deserve to not settle for like a whatever job, a whatever career, a whatever partner, a whatever, you know, model of a relationship even, to like, you deserve what you want, right? And you deserve to have your basic needs met, because then your activism and your community is going to involve putting someone else genuinely first, right? Because you believe you deserve that, so they must too. And then you're going to do whatever you took, like whatever work you did to achieve, to get your basic needs met. That didn't involve you caging yourself, right? Like, I'm not like a better person today because I went to prison, right? That's not something I had to go through. So what is the real reason I got a degree? What is the real reason I went to college? Because it wasn't prison, right? And I actively had to acknowledge that I was toxic and was responsible for harm in other ways, right? Because I hadn't looked inside, because I kept wanting to rely on other people to meet my needs. So a lot of community is about being alone first and being comfortable being alone, and then going out looking for community, because then you can actually give people what they deserve, right? Which is your whole self, like your best self, literally. So I think that's like this time, to be honest. Oh yeah, Corey, do you want to pop in and ask that?
Yeah, I was thinking, just given your expertise, what your ideal take would be on the process for determining vaccination priority, considering that as the vaccine does get produced, in the early stages, there won't be enough for the whole population.
Yeah. Actually, more than even being enough, I don't even know how we're going to get it to people, to be honest. We don't have existing infrastructure, because we don't believe healthcare is accessible, right? Like that's where we're starting off of. So people live 100 miles away, and that's normal, like completely normal. It's totally normal for people to live in food deserts, right? It's totally normal for people to never ever get any kind of direct contact with a expert, you know, social health worker, community health worker, physician, because we don't prioritize community outreach, right? Like that was partly why COVID was such a disaster, because people were getting information from several different sources without having a reliable source. When that's what student activism taught me, though, because I instituted a really simple system at like our hospital system, which involved just giving people updates about the most relevant information in terms of COVID, like what are we learning about the virus and how does that affect your life? And that meant that they didn't have to like turn to a million different things on Facebook and Twitter to get information. It was just like, okay, cool. Like this is like it was systematic public outreach, right? And it was sourced and cited and well supported and well backed and whatnot. So, but that doesn't exist at a community level, right? It takes a lot of privilege to have an email address. It takes a lot of privilege to have a phone to check, to keep refreshing, right, for updates. And majority of communities actually don't live with that kind of access. So my fear, rather than even making enough, is like infrastructure. How are we going to get it there? And two, once we even get it there, given the history of like how, you know, medicine and healthcare has like abused communities of color in this country, right? Like from something like the Tuskegee study to like Henrietta Lacks and like other, literally like the founding of, for example, OBGYN was on by, you know, experimenting and developing surgical procedures on Black women without anesthesia, right? So that's what we're starting on again. That's why I talk about like decolonizing being like, it has to be the goal, because if your foundation is rotten, who cares what you build on, right? It's a weak foundation. And anything that you build on is going to be so like weak and brief and unsustainable. So my worry is with those communities who have a justified, like, I don't want to call it mistrust, but like a justified harm that has been caused by the healthcare system, how are we going to make ourselves accessible to them, right? And how are we going to deal with genuinely changing the infrastructure of healthcare to where we're no longer actively killing Black and brown people? Because that's still a thing, right? Like I see it on a regular basis when I'm rounding, where pain management for like Black folks and brown folks is a whole different ballgame than pain management for like white patients, right? And there's now huge studies from like the New England Journal of Medicine even that show that Black babies are 3 times more likely to survive if they have a Black doctor, right? And Black women are more likely to die after childbirth because specifically their complications, their childbirth complications, are not believed and neglected because their pain levels aren't believed. Essentially, when they say they are at a 10, that's like, okay, you're not at a 10, right? And that's usually a sign that there's something going on that needs to be addressed. And so we currently exist in a framework of healthcare that's like very, very honestly dangerous, right? And it's so hard to like live that reality, which is why I do think that that's how I justified existing within the system to myself, right? That to me, having one person on our side that's doing infectious diseases that has a context of like grassroots activism and like, you know, social justice meant that people receiving information from me about science and medicine understood that I thought about all these things when I do my science, right? And therefore, I'm not going to, I don't know, like give them a drug because I'm just like, you know, working for Big Pharma, right? Because that just fundamentally is against every single social justice principle imaginable, right? I'm not going to do that. So there's a level of trust that comes with. And I think that might kind of be the first step, like thinking about who's valuable in these communities. And it's like healthcare workers of color and healthcare workers that are, you know, queer, that are like, have community ties, right? And that's why I say student activism is so crucial for the rest of your life, because if you know how to mobilize, that's like the strongest thing that you can do for your community at any given point, right? Like I was able to get people like the testing that they needed at like much higher rates than other people were getting, because I was just, I knew how to do something as simple as like a WhatsApp, right? I knew something as simple as like using my Instagram story to like answer questions, because people were freaking out about things that they didn't need to freak out about, right? And that in itself like changed the dynamics of like, oh, okay, so now we can calm down because like I trust this person, they're mass mobilizing, whether it's information or people or mutual aid, whatever it is, right? Like you need to have that knowledge, and that can't come from any other space in some weird way rather than activism and community-based activism. Like even like keyboard like being, you know, just if you read or write or whatever, that's not going to give you that toolkit, right? On like how to frame language. Something as simple as like, you can say like racial capitalism is a system of oppression that may, you know, incentivizes all other systemic injustice, blah, 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 blah. But like, I eventually thought like, okay, the people that I'm advocating for, are they going to understand what I just said? Because that's who's being affected by this, right? And they're not. But asking them if they have food to eat, and if not, then why, you know, which system of power is keeping it that way, and which system of power is benefiting from that, is like a simple way of meeting people where they're at, that takes away power dynamics, right? And decolonizes like intellectualism, which is such an elite concept that like assumes that people with degrees are somehow incapable of harming someone, right? Or that's all you need to be an expert, rather than, you know, having gone through like 50 years of living under an oppressive system, right? Which is also expertise, but it's just not a diploma, right? And I think that's like super important. Yeah, so any like last thoughts, any last like reflections or anything that anyone else has before we kind of wrap up? Anyone that especially hasn't had a chance to say anything yet? I'm gonna drop my email and Instagram, because that's like the 2 things I check. And if you do want to ever like contact me to, you know, talk about student activism, whether it's like personal stuff or like career related stuff, mentorship stuff, just like feel free to do so. I think it's important to like know someone who knows someone who knows someone.
And on that note, I just want to say, thank you so much for everyone for joining us tonight, and a special thank you to Ayesha. Thank you so much for just taking the time out of your day and really talking to us about all of these different ways of thinking and really helping us kind of move along on our journey. And I really, really appreciate everything that you're doing. So with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone. And again, feel free to contact Ayesha through her email. We will be sending out a follow-up email with this information as well as a recording of this session in case you feel that a lot of folks would benefit from it as well. And so with that, I want to say thank you, everyone, and have a great night.